You know, we in the video game reviewing community tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves when reviewing our favorite games, I find. I mean, you want to do a good job every time, but when it's one of your favorite and most passionate things, you want to fire on all cylinders. Today we're talking about Resident Evil 4, which I'm sure you can no doubt tell because of the title of the video and because there's a poster of it right next to me, and this coat, which admittedly cost a lot of money, but I thought it was cool and from one of my favorite games, so why not buy it? And that's the funny thing though. This game first released in the GameCube in 2005 and has since been ported to PS2 and a plethora of other consoles. But unlike many of my other favorite games, I wasn't playing this game back when it was first released. I mean, it would be weird if I was. I hear these stories of people growing up with games like Metal Gear or Resident Evil, and I just wonder how that's even possible, because, I just barely managed to play games that were rated T, like Jak and Daxter or Ratchet and Clank when I was a kid. But I feel like even my parents would have stopped at Resident Evil 4 with the chainsaw guy. So yeah, I wasn't playing it back when it came out, but I also haven't been playing it for a very long time either. I've owned this PS4 copy of Resident Evil 4 since 2018, and I only got around to just playing it in the last 2.5 years or so, which I'm sure you can all relate to in the audience. I got these God of War games 5 years ago, and I only just got around to playing them in the last 6 months, but I'm getting very off topic as usual. Resident Evil 4, like many of the games I picked up on a whim, is a game that took a while for me to really click with it, but once it did, I knew I wanted more of it. And that's when I picked up the Resident Evil 2 remake on PS4, and that's what convinced me I was a fan of scary games, and Resident Evil specifically. I talk about the Resident Evil 2 remake all the time on the channel because it's my favorite game in the series, but make no mistake, I think Resident Evil 4 is an all-time classic. I have an almost equally sickening amount of playtime in both RE2 make and RE4. Resident Evil 4 is just one of those games where there are a few like it in terms of its unique mechanics and how they're mixing with the game design. So once you've gotten accustomed to it, it's hard not to keep coming back to it. And with that said, where do we even begin with this one? Well, were you aware that Resident Evil 4 was going to be Devil May Cry? You probably were. This is one of those gaming facts that's so well known that you aren't cool for knowing it, but I'm talking about it anyway because I actually didn't before playing this game. I said I first bought RE4 back in 2018, and it was on that day in GameStop where I was sifting through the PS4 section and saw that the Devil May Cry HD collection and Resident Evil 4 were right next to each other. Both of which are popular Capcom IPs I hadn't played, Capcom being one of my favorite publishers in the industry, so why not give them a shot? I had only played DMC at first and became obsessed with the franchise, it being one of my other favorite IPs. See the poster on the other side of the RE4 one. When I reviewed Devil May Cry 1, 2, and 3 in a video, I had mentioned RE4 being a game I had got alongside it but had yet to play, to which the comments then told me about this being ironic given the shared history of these games. Numerous Resident Evil projects were in development at once in the late 90s and early 2000s. Hideki Kamiya, director of Resident Evil 2, was working on RE4 for the PlayStation 2, this game being more gothic in its art design than previous RE games with a focus on sick, stylish action. Shinji Mikami, director of RE1, had said that the game was straying a little too far from what the RE series was and that this new game might just be better off as a new IP, and thus Devil May Cry was born. Retaining some of the exploration, isolated setting, and spooky vibes, but with badass sword combat against an army of demons. I just find this story so interesting because it concerns two of my favorite games, and them sprouting from the same origin point was just cool to learn. RE4 then started anew, going through numerous revisions on the idea, still centering itself around the traditional fixed-camera gameplay the RE series was known for, bringing Raccoon City survivor Leon Kennedy back to the forefront for this one. However, things had changed while RE4 was being worked on. I had mentioned in my video on Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 0 that franchise fatigue was setting in for RE. 0 was the sixth mainline game to feature the same kind of gameplay and progression. Critics had liked both games, but felt that the RE formula was a bit played out. These two games being GameCube exclusives had hurt their sales as well. Mikami simply thought it was time for the RE series to do something much different if it was going to be a relevant series. Kind of ironic considering the fact that this idea is why DMC became its own property to begin with. But perhaps it's just a case of hindsight being 2020. Mikami stated that the RE games by Remake and 0 just started to feel predictable, losing a lot of the tension that you had when the PS1 games were new. I think Remake is the best designed classic RE game, but I can definitely see where he and all the critics at the time were coming from, considering the fact that in 6 years there were 6 main games, 2 of which released in the same year. RE0 separated itself from the 5 previous entries with a boatload of gimmicks that I didn't think added to the experience in any meaningful way. On top of that, the experience the gimmicks were trying to add onto was one I had little to say about because yeah, it's all been said and done before. So Resident Evil 4 was going to go in a new, action-oriented direction to hopefully breathe some life into the series. Evidently, not everyone on the team felt passionate about RE4's new direction, and I can imagine why. Your skills and interests have been with slower-paced horror games, and now you have to make a game with explosions, roundhouse kicks, and minecart rides? I'd imagine it was jarring, and I can also imagine it being kind of scary in a way to do something new like this. Who knows if people would even like it? Is this the moment Resident Evil jumps the shark and can never recover? But thankfully, that's not how it played out.
After several scrapped builds and a whole new franchise rising from it, Resident Evil 4 finally released on the GameCube in early 2005, and it is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. Perfect scores from countless outlets, a near-perfect audience response, several awards for Game of the Year, Game of the Decade, and now greatest games of all time. Also, one of the most influential games to ever exist, right up there with classics like Super Mario Bros. Or Zelda Ocarina of Time. Redefining survival horror and third-person shooter games entirely, inspiring a plethora of iconic games like Dead Space and The Last of Us. Selling over 1 million copies on GameCube, but then the floodgates were opened when the game was ported to the PlayStation 2, where it sold over 2 million copies, which is something I speculated about in my remake video. That the audience for a mature game is just going to be bigger on the other consoles. But I also think RE4 was a lot different. Remake and Zero were more Resident Evil. Resident Evil 4 was a gaming phenomenon, one of those games you have to play and have an opinion on. At this point, RE4 has been ported to pretty much every console that has ever existed since its release, selling over 11 million copies since it first debuted. Which begs the question, how am I going to play this classic game for the video? As I just said, there's an exhaustive list of RE4 re-releases, so I won't even try to cover that in this video. I own the game on GameCube, PS2, Wii, PS3, PS4, and PC. The GameCube version is the original, so it has its charm, seeing the game as originally presented. The PS2 port added a lot of new content that's synonymous with the game at this point, but is awful in terms of sound quality and visuals, everything being massively downgraded to fit the entire game onto one DVD. The Wii is a really popular option that I have actually never played before, but people really dig it due to its motion-controlled aiming. Perhaps I'll get to it another day. The PS3 and 360 was the game's first time appearing in HD, although it was still 30 FPS like its prior releases. The Ultimate HD edition on PS4, Xbox One, and Steam was its first time being 60 FPS, making me gravitate towards that. The PC version gets bonus points because the HD editions of RE4, like Remake, have very poorly upscaled textures, making the game look pretty dated when playing it in HD. One of the main reasons I like to stick to playing old games on old consoles. However, shortly after the HD edition's release in 2014, a passionate fan team began working on a total texture overhaul to make a proper 4K rendition of RE4 that you can mod onto the Steam version for PC. Now it's fully playable and free to download, you just have to own the game on Steam. 60 FPS alone made the 8th gen version of RE4 the best one, but this PC project makes that pretty hard to dispute in my eyes since it's the cleanest visually and offers so many great quality of life features like being able to expand the field of view, which is why the game looks zoomed out in this footage for any RE4 veterans who are wondering about that. I'll leave a link to their page below, it's excellent stuff. Now with all that said, it's time we dive into RE4 and really see what makes it such a special game. I see no better time to begin than the present, so let's do it.
Resident Evil 4.
RE4 paves a new path for the series from the opening cutscene. It begins with a monologue from Leon who goes over everything you need to know about the status quo of the RE series thus far. The first 5 games in the timeline were all about the T-Virus developed by Umbrella Corp. Leon recaps that the incidents from the mountains in RE0 and RE1 had led to the T-Virus leaking into Raccoon City in RE2 and 3. RE3 ending with the city being wiped off the face of the earth from a missile attack to stop the virus from spreading. Each game was building upon the mystery of Umbrella more and more. As RE1 established the basics of them and the virus, RE2 showed how the entire city was bought off by Umbrella, RE3 put the consequences of those actions on full display, and then Code Veronica and RE0 had fleshed out the backstory a little more. By the end of Code Veronica, it seemed like the next time was finally going to be the game where Umbrella gets taken out, something RE2 also hyped up. However, like I said, RE4 is not interested in doing more of the same. The first sign of that is that the game takes place 6 years after the Raccoon City arc. Leon quickly establishes before the opening is even over that Umbrella's being behind the T-Virus that destroyed Raccoon City was revealed, an obvious PR disaster. Their stock price fell and Umbrella went out of business. That was the end of that. I suppose if you spent all those years hyped to see a game about taking down Umbrella, but the resolution was them losing all their money and going out of business, that would be pretty anticlimactic, although not entirely unrealistic. Not to say RE4 has nothing to do with Umbrella, because it does, those consequences hang over the rest of the series, but that the story is not following the same mold as the previous ones. It was intentional as they wanted to tell a new story. Leon Kennedy, following his survival in RE2, was recruited by the US government to become one of the agents responsible for protecting the president and his family, receiving all kinds of training to become an action movie badass. The president's daughter, Ashley, was abducted from her university, and now it's up to Leon to travel to a mysterious, rural part of Europe to find her. But he encounters a village full of hostile locals attacking him with pitchforks, axes, and chainsaws. Leon must get through the hordes to rescue Ashley, but also contend with the cult of the area, the Los Illuminados, who have infected the entire village, as well as Leon and Ashley with their virus, Las Plagas. a parasite that takes over your body and makes you a slave to the Los Illuminados, currently led by Osmond Sadler. Leon and Ashley's only hope being that the virus takes a long time to fully take over, so that they have to not only escape from these enemies, but also find a cure before it's too late, setting up Resident Evil 4. Now that we can get into the gameplay, what makes RE4 so stand out from a gameplay perspective? After all, the game still utilizes the same tank controls as the previous games did. The only directions you can go in are forward, left, right, and backwards, using the quick turn to move 180 degrees on a dime. If you're familiar with the previous games, there should be something you can get to grips with. It's the fixed camera angles that are gone. Instead, the camera is centered behind Leon's back and you use the right analog stick to see what his immediate surroundings are. The change to the camera makes the controls feel completely new. This game doesn't have any of the jank that would come from switching screens with an analog stick that the previous games had because the camera is centered on Leon's back. If you've played more modern games, it will be a bit of an adjustment that you have to stop and then quick turn to move around, but it clicks fast. At least it does for me. Some people despise tank controls in the previous games, and I never really had a counter-argument to that besides, well, it worked for me, and the same pretty much goes for RE4. Now that's just the camera. It's the shooting that was the most revolutionary thing in RE4. Before this game, there was no set industry standard on how to handle third-person shooting. The first Halo game on Xbox, it pretty much standardized the twin-stick model of shooting on consoles in first-person, but in third-person, you'd have all kinds of systems that varied from game to game. The RE games relied on the same lock-on they always had, and games like Ratchet & Clank had improved the strafing and lock-on with each game, eventually working in the twin-stick shooting with its third-person gameplay. The Metal Gear games relied on first-person aiming modes but allowed you to run and shoot by holding down multiple buttons if you needed to shoot in third-person, but it never felt very good to do. Resident Evil 4 standardized over-the-shoulder shooting. It's hard to imagine a gaming landscape where this wasn't a standard feature, but this game is the one to make it a universal thing. You press one of the shoulder buttons and Leon will lift his gun, and you move the stick to point where he's going to aim and then fire in that direction. And then after that, all other third-person action games, including ones released in the franchises I just mentioned, adopted this playstyle because there was no better way to go about it. If you play RE4 for the first time after having played games inspired by it, it will seem a bit odd because Leon is frozen in place during this aiming mode when later third-person shooters allow the character to move while aiming and shooting. RE4 simply does not, which is the hardest part about getting into this game. When you do get into it, you realize that this wasn't an oversight in the design of RE4, it was built this way on purpose. Resource management has always been a core pillar of the Resident Evil games, and RE4 has taken that philosophy and designed a combat system with that in mind. You'll get a lot more ammo in RE4 than any previous game in the series, whether that be from crates or just being dropped by defeated enemies, giving you the ability to blast through foes like never before. However, you also don't want to just waste all the ammo you have on every enemy you see. First, it's because you can't just hoard a stockpile of ammo anyway. The game introduces an entirely new system for the inventory. Pausing the game opens your inventory case, a grid system where different items like herbs, ammo, and guns take up a differing amount of space, as you can customize how they're arranged to make sure you have enough space for all the stuff in your possession. Organizing things in RE4 is a game in its own right, each upgrade to your storage feeling really satisfying as you can then expand the possibilities of how you manage the space you have. But back to the actual gameplay. The combat is a loop of aiming for weak spots on enemies like their heads or their knees, causing them to stagger, which allows you to get close and execute a combo move like a kick or a full-on suplex. This is not just to look cool, it's also useful because you get plenty of invincibility frames while doing it, important when dealing with crowds. If that didn't finish them off, the knife is now a permanent item that doesn't take up any space in your inventory. You grab it with another one of the shoulder buttons and can use it to bust boxes or slash at downed enemies, hopefully finishing them off before they get back up. So you do have lots of ammo at all times, but you want to make intelligent use of the aiming system by only firing at the weak spots and doing close quarters combat from there, thus saving your ammo for bosses or just bigger enemies like the chainsaw guy. This game is pretty long, and yet this combat loop is something I never get sick of. It keeps you engaged with the moment-to-moment action. Your mind is always on your inventory and what weapons are best suited for different circumstances, and it's also optimized for tension. Like I said, you can't move while aiming. As a result, when multiple enemies start to approach Leon, you really hope you can land a good headshot and then kick one of those enemies, sending them all flying away from you, giving you the chance to put some more distance between you and them. The enemies themselves are also an exciting part of RE4's combat. Mikami said in reference to Remake and Zero that Resident Evil was losing a lot of its tension. Yeah, that introduced new enemies like Remake's Crimson Heads or Zero's Leeches, but the basic zombie routine was starting to become mundane and predictable. The Ganados you face in RE4 are completely new in how you approach them. First, because of the game's combat controls. Second, because of the AI. Zombies walked slowly and did one thing: bite. Once you've figured out how to get past zombies in RE1, and maybe after you've adjusted to how many enemies are on screen in RE2, the basic zombie is just not a threat in RE3 and onward. The Ganados can swarm players, attacking you from all directions and can wield weapons like I mentioned before. Some toss axes at you, toss explosives, or try to get up close with pitchforks and blowtorches. Every one of these attacks has different strategies you can use to dodge them, like shooting the explosives once they've been tossed so that they destroy the enemy and the ones surrounding them instead of you. But since you can't move while aiming, it's a risk versus reward system. Enemies can also duck and dodge as they approach you, throwing off your shaky aiming. Because of all this, I'm sure you can see why the combat in RE4 left such an impression on both Resident Evil fans and the general gaming audience. It was a fresh new experience with a plethora of different tactics you have to learn to use and fight against. The prologue ends with Leon in a massive firefight against the entire village. In my many playthroughs of this game on New Game Plus, I've become super adept at this section, but when starting a fresh file with less health and no weapons, getting your butt kicked here is pretty common. This part serves as a pretty good tutorial for the entire game as the enemies are relentless. Taking them head on with all your ammo is very liable to get you killed. Instead, your best practice is exploring the different houses to find more ammo and supplies like the shotgun. But you have to move fast because any house you bust into, they will kick down the door of. Any upper area you find is one they'll put a ladder up next to. There's no escape, you must strategically fight your way through them, and it's pretty exciting on every playthrough, as the horde only leaves upon hearing the church bell.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Throughout the campaign, the combat stands tall on a mechanical level, but the experience is heightened via the game's sound design. I wouldn't call RE4 a scary game by any means. To be fair, there weren't that many moments I was scared of in the earlier games besides the ever-present fear of losing progress, but I'd say RE4 wasn't really going for a truly scary vibe. Tense is the word I'd go for, and the game is packed full of it. I've already explained how the combat mechanics and enemies create tension when put together, but combine that with the sound and that's when you get an atmosphere unique to RE4. The game almost exclusively plays music in combat. Outside of that, you have the usual safe areas where you get music, but otherwise the OST consists mostly of battle themes that kick in when fighting enemies. You'll walk into a room and music will start playing. You might not even know where the enemies are or which they might be, however the music is a cue that you need to stay alert at this moment and it really works wonders. On the flip side, when you finally clear a room of enemies and the music vanishes, you're met with silence, and it's a relieving feeling when it might be used to heighten the fear factor in other games. While in combat, you'll hear the enemies scream at you from all directions, but you can only see what's in front of, above, and next to Leon, so hearing sounds from behind further increases that tension mid-combat. Even using that effect for fake-out jump scares, like when you walk into the castle sewers and hear every time I get somewhat anxious hearing that, but there was nothing behind you. But when you hear it next, you're met with enemies that can go invisible. You always gotta stay alert in this game. RE4 takes these elements that are in many ways different and unorthodox and uses them to craft an experience like no other, and I think that still holds up when playing it today. As established, it's endlessly replayable because of this tense survival horror shooter combat. It's good that the game is replayable based on that alone because replayability has always been another core tenet of the franchise, RE4 just getting it from a completely different source than previous games. Resi 4 is not a game about items being required for progression and the game getting faster if you know where they all are and in what order you need to obtain them like the previous games. This game is almost entirely linear. You do revisit some of the same locations, like how the opening area leads to the main village, and you circle back to this spot several times throughout the village chapter, or how you can't progress forward when you arrive at the castle, so you do a complete circle around the entire thing, collecting the items you need to get through the area previously closed off. But getting through that is not an element that requires thought. You pretty much just follow the path the game gives you and you will eventually wind up exactly where you need to be, no backtracking required. Sometimes you'll find key items that are needed to progress, like a key that opens the door, but oftentimes you get that by defeating all the enemies in the room and opening the door that leads to the next area, or just find the key items while you're circling through areas. It's nothing like past games on that note. After my playthrough of RE0, I certainly can't complain, but that's not to say RE4 brings nothing to the table in terms of exploration. Within each major segment of the game, you can get your hands on a treasure map which does exactly what you'd expect. You can use this to know what areas you should be looking out for, as loads of rooms will hide treasures for players curious enough to find it. Like shooting this light in the cave where each chain had treasure on the end of it, or shooting the back wall of the castle's main entrance. You wouldn't really have a reason to look towards the way you came in, but if you do, treasure for you. But what do you do with all that treasure? Another new mechanic in Resi 4 is the merchant, this dude who has set up shop throughout the locations in the game and sells Leon all kinds of goods in exchange for currency you find from defeated enemies or in boxes. There's a lot you can do here. From the merchant, you can sell off your treasure for a high price, but managing your treasure is another sub-game in and of itself. Like older titles, you can combine things in the menu, only it's not meant to solve puzzles, but rather you can combine certain treasures to make them more valuable. In the castle, you find the butterfly lamp, which is worth a lot on its own, but it has 3 extra slots. The invisible enemies drop one of 3 gems, red, green, and blue. You need to place one of each in the slots to make the lamp worth a lot more than it was before, blue gems being the most rare drop from the invisible bug enemies. So you either choose to cash in quickly and get a lower rate, or you wait until you find all 3 gem types and then sell for a higher price. Everything is useful in this game, like the herbs you find. Green ones still boost your health, red maximizes the effects of green, and now you have yellow herbs that combine with green to increase your maximum health. I always spend my first playthrough on a fresh file upgrading Leon's health bar, but then we'll focus on upgrading Ashley's on New Game Plus. If I come back to that file again, yellow herbs can still be mixed with the other types and then sold for a decent price to the merchant. That's what I mean when I say everything is useful in this game, regardless of how many playthroughs you've done. From the merchant, you can buy things like the treasure maps or the upgraded item slots. But most importantly, new weapons, and there's an exhaustive list of them in this game. When I play, I try to focus on the essentials. I always keep a handgun for direct encounters, a shotgun for crowd control, a sniper for distance, and the TMP for enemies with a lot of health. Later in the game, I do get one of the magnums for extra damage once I can fit into my inventory. There are several types of weapons, but then multiple weapons in the same class. Like this handgun being better at piercing enemies, but this one fires faster. I sell my handgun pretty early so I can get my hands on the Red 9 gun, which can be upgraded with a stock to better stabilize your aim. Although a fully maxed out handgun gets this headshot multiplier where your chance of getting a critical hit goes up by 5 times, really turning the tides in your favor, especially on professional difficulty, so I wouldn't say you should sell it if doing damage is what you want to do the most. But then for the other weapon types, you'll get a regular shotgun and rifle early, but when you reach the castle on the island, newer, stronger models will be in the shop so you can sell the ones you already have and get the better ones, which is what I do. Then you'll switch over to the merchant's third tab and see you can buy upgrades to your weapons like an increase to the rate of fire, the fire power, the reload time, and the maximum ammo count. These are all lifesavers, like the reload times. Early in the game, reloading mid-fight could get you damaged, but when it's quicker, you feel really unstoppable. I love upgrading the ammo capacity on weapons I'm out of ammo for, as it also gives you a full supply when you buy it. Another strategic element that arises from the game's shop mechanic. The asshole doesn't sell you any ammo though, despite being surrounded by it at all times, but hey, can't make it too easy, right? On that note, RE4 introduces all the things I've talked about thus far within the first 90 minutes or so. But the game is not content with that status quo for the next several hours of gameplay. This game is constantly introducing new things to shake up the experience. After the first chapter of the game is over, you'll see some Ganados, same as what you've gotten used to at this point, but then the Plagas will burst out of this guy's head. While in this state, the Ganado will be more like a zombie, but you need to worry about the ultra-powerful parasite that bursted on top of him that will lunge a long claw at the player doing massive damage. Adding a new dynamic to fighting enemies as you might aim for the head since it's the biggest weak spot in the Ganados, but you need to be careful because they might expose the Plagas if you do. Pro tip, the Plagas heads are weak to the flashbang grenades. It will destroy them in one hit and stun other enemies. Everything has a use in this game. As if that wasn't good enough, you rescue Ashley shortly after that, which also changes the dynamic of the game for the next hour or so of gameplay. The player has to make sure enemies don't get to Ashley again and take her away, and also manage her health bar with your inventory. You need to fight enemies for yourself and for her too, as her dying or getting abducted is a game over. With Ashley, you can hide her in dumpsters when they show up while you beat enemies, or just hope you have the skills to make sure both you and her survive, like this enemy rush in the castle. While on the move, you can command her to follow you or to hold off, or use machinery needed to progress while you keep fighting enemies. Can't say the game has any complex brain teasers as a result of this dynamic. In fact, I'd say these are the easiest puzzles in any RE game I've ever played. Like this one where the solution is just hitting 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Or this other one where Ashley has to stand on one switch on one side of a door, and then Leon has to go to the other located 5 steps away. I only highlight this one because I'm betting Sucker Punch was inspired by this puzzle of all things for the double button security doors in Sly 3. Gotta mention Sly somewhere. Ashley will follow Leon for a while after rescuing her from the village, but whenever the game has gotten a lot of mileage out of protecting her, she'll be recaptured in a cutscene. You'll have to go back to just playing as Leon until you rescue her for the final time at the end of the game. Again, this game is packed full of variety. Nothing ever goes on too long because it's constantly refreshing itself. Whether that's via Ashley being with you or not with you, or the game introducing a new boss that comes with a different strategy than before, or an enemy rush where the player's overwhelmed by hordes of Ganado bursting into the tiny house you're holed up in, climbing a tower with an elevator that more enemies keep jumping down, or riding on a minecart where you need to shoot enemies and obstacles before running into them, or battling these enemies that hit like a tank but can't see, only tracking you via the sound you make. I managed to get this first one in a loop for an easy kill, to my surprise. The castle also has a great mini-boss with Verdugo in the sewers. This one is tense with the limited camera as it's chasing you, intimidating as an enemy since it absorbs bullets but has an interesting strategy to defeat it, knocking over these liquid nitrogen capsules to freeze it temporarily. A rocket launcher just destroys it in one shot while frozen, giving you a massive treasure reward. But there's options here as you don't even need to defeat it at all if you want to save that ammo by waiting for the elevator to show up. More of that RE4 variety at its finest. You start off in the village for the first few hours with the basic ganado and the village chief as your antagonist. Once you clear that, you make it to the castle run by Ramon Salazar, who is your new foil. And you have tougher enemies via the cultists. Many of the same principles apply from the villagers, but these guys have deadlier weapons, more armor, and are generally creepier, growing their own kind of Plagas heads that will attack you after their former host is defeated entirely. This castle segment lasts a few more hours, and then you reach the island where Sadler's hiding out with new enemies yet again that are the toughest in the game before you reach the final boss with Sadler himself. I hear that some people start to lose steam with this game once you reach the island, although I personally can't relate. The boss with Salazar certainly feels like a final boss in terms of the climactic build-up, but the island does enough in terms of new set pieces like the car chase or the scaffold monster fight to feel new. Introducing threats like regenerators that move and try to eat you like a zombie, but have, as the name suggests, health and appendages that grow back unless you use an infrared scope on your rifle to see their external Plagas parasites. The introduction of this monster probably being the scariest part of the game as it busts down the door it was behind, just outside of the player's view. Then the game mixes up how you fight the thing every time one of them shows up, like how some have Plagas you shoot in the front, but then others have them on their backs, and so you need to shoot their legs first to expose their weak spots. It's plenty to keep you mechanically engaged. Which is great because the story is certainly not going to do that on its own. Perhaps that's a bit too harsh. I just mean to say that RE4's plot is not one for the ages, and that's mostly due to the presentation. Now, I think RE4 is the most entertaining plot in the series thus far. Visually, I mean that unironically, as the game has all these motion-captured action scenes that still capture your attention. Even the slow-motion bits, a common 2000s cliche, didn't feel out of place in these cutscenes like they did in other works from the time. You're forced to pay attention to the cutscenes as they include QuickTime events, another industry staple from the late 2000s that got popularized by this game. But its usage of them in cutscenes is what forces you to be on the edge of your seat during action scenes, if the visual spectacle wasn't enough. Now, ironically, I find this game very entertaining because this might be the hammiest script in the series since RE1. RE2 and onward felt a lot more straight-faced in terms of story. RE1 and Code Veronica just feeling like the hammy elements were an accident. The case could be made for RE1 that it was supposed to be like a sci-fi B-movie, which I get, but acting that bad just doesn't feel like a joke to me. But if RE1 was trying to be a cheesy sci-fi B-movie, then RE4 is entirely trying to be a cheesy American action spy thriller type movie. As I said way before, Leon has just gotten magic agent training that leaves him prepared for every single situation, like a grappling hook on his belt, or the ability to run up walls and backflip over lasers. It's funny how this John Wick type action just became Leon's character for the entire rest of the series. If it's RE2 era Leon, you gotta write him as a normal human, but post RE2, I would be surprised if there was a stunt he couldn't survive. But as I was saying, Leon is packed full of one-liners in this game, and sometimes it genuinely lands, like the bingo line at the beginning of the prologue, or the famous,
"I've sent my right hand to dispose of you."
Your right hand comes off?
but other times I'm chuckling at the dialogue because it's terrible.
"I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer."
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
"I've been expecting you, my brethrens."
No thanks, bro.
Perhaps you are disillusioned with overconfidence, just because you killed my small-time subordinate.
Sadler, you're small time.
But like RE1, whether it was meant to be ironic or not, I always have a great time with the story because it's so entertaining. I just mean to say that if you care about the raw plot of the RE games, RE4 is not going to offer that much. Although, there is some interesting lore to follow in this game via the optional files. This game not directly being about Umbrella again allows the pages of text you find to feel more interesting because we don't know anything about Las Plagas or the Los Illuminados, so hearing about what the parasite does is interesting rather than feeling samey. The Plagas has an intriguing history, having been sealed away in the caverns of the castle generations ago by the Salazar family as they stood watch over it for decades, hoping the evil of the Los Illuminados would never rise again. But Ramon Salazar felt like that treatment was harsh and personally aided the group's revival, which started by infecting the villagers with the parasite as members of it were contracted to explore the caverns for it. The credits of the game show you that this village used to be a peaceful and joyous community before Sadler arrived and became their master, as these innocent people became the vicious combatants that Leon has faced off against at the start of the game. When I first saw this, I was thinking, darn, maybe I should feel bad the game is so much fun. One playthrough later, nah, it's pretty fun to play, but darn, that's pretty messed up backstory. However, to return to the main plot, some parts don't make any sense, like how the game introduces this new character called Jack Krauser. He was once a fellow agent alongside Leon, but was presumed dead until he joined forces with Sadler, capturing Ashley to gain his trust. The game introduces this guy in this cinematic moment where he dramatically looks into the camera, as if the audience should be shocked that Krauser's in the game, making me think he was a pre-established character in the series, since this was my first RE game, But he's a completely new character invented for this game, so what was the point of the dramatic reveal? I don't get it. The only impression he leaves on you after you beat the game is how easily broken his boss fight is with the knife. They also introduced Luis Serra as an ally to Leon, who has been the one doing the research on the parasite for Sadler, but is now on the run from the Los Illuminados. He's likable when he appears, but then he gets this really dramatic death scene that does not feel remotely earned with this super campy story when he's only appeared like 3 times before this. But then they don't make dramatic things nearly as dramatic as they could be. Ada is back in RE4, but in canon, Leon learned of Ada's survival off-screen, so therefore the story doesn't get much out of their first scene together. To be fair, in the original RE2, Leon can clearly hear that Ada was the one to drop him the rocket launcher, when in the remake of that game he has no idea where it came from, presuming Ada was dead at the end. I'm just saying that the story could have gotten some drama out of this scene if they wanted to do that. Instead, Leon just confirms that Ada works for Wesker, who is scheming something in this story. It's just not confirmed in this game until the end, where Ada gets away with the Plagas sample. In the PS2 release of RE4, they added a new mode called Separate Ways, starring Ada. It shows what she was up to during various points of Leon's mission. The main campaign shows that she's watching you from the shadows, but it's here where we see some examples. Ada was the one to ring the church bell in the opening to draw the Ganados away from Leon, or how she saved him from the village chief. Wesker wanted Leon, a survivor of Raccoon City, to be eliminated, but Ada went against the plan and saved him from Krauser. She has affection for Leon, but like always, she's got a bottom line, and that was getting Leon to beat Sadler so she could get the Plagas sample and finish her mission. Separate Ways is a significantly truncated route through some of RE4's content while playing as Ada, so there isn't much to say besides the story stuff. Except the presentations of the cutscenes, that is. They are as well made as the ones from the main game, but since this was created for the PS2 version, all the cutscenes are pre-rendered and are quite crusty as a result. I mentioned at the top of the video that this version was significantly downgraded in terms of sound and visual quality to fit on the disc. But it's cool that they added some post-game content in a game that already has so much of it in the campaign. I mean, it was only about a year and a half ago when I first decided to try out the Mercenaries mode, and I was kicking myself for having never played it sooner. This is an entire mode where you have to eliminate as many enemies as possible on these 4 combat maps, 3 of which were lifted from the campaign. You have a time limit that you can extend with hourglasses scattered throughout the maps, as you then get more points for consecutive eliminations that can be multiplied with this point bonus multiplier you find. You start only as Leon, but then you can unlock Ada, Wesker, Krauser, and Hunk, one of the agents who tried to recover the G-Virus from RE2, which caused the T-Virus to leak into the city. Turns out this guy was playable in the 4th survivor mode from RE2, which I didn't even know existed until like 2 seconds ago, because you need to get an A rank in a campaign of RE2, and I just happen to be terrible at the rankings of those games. But all that's neither here nor there. Mercenary mode caused my playtime of RE4 to skyrocket because I can simply turn the game on and play a few maps as a couple characters and call it a day. The game's combat mechanics are great fun, and so a mode just dedicated to that with the element of trying to get as many enemies beaten before the combo counter runs out is always fun, each character coming with different weapons and abilities that further increases the variety. Kind of a shame that Leon is the weakest character in terms of weapon selection, but still, the extra challenge is nice. Wesker being really fun to play as with all the ammo and weapons he gets. Krauser getting special powers like he did in the campaign. Ada has more ammo than Leon, so sometimes I'll play as her over him, but regardless of whichever character you pick, you're bound to have a good time. Which I suppose is how you could sum up the entire game. RE4 is endlessly replayable, even in the campaign as you unlock New Game Plus, where all your equipment carries over as you replay the game, now being way more powerful as you continue to upgrade your weapons and get better ones. Or you could start a new fresh file on professional difficulty for an even greater challenge. This took me a while to get through, but it was really satisfying. Beating the game on professional difficulty awarding you with this screen nuke laser gun, and beating Separate Ways gives you an unlimited ammo machine gun, and you can then buy an infinite ammo rocket launcher from the merchant, turning you into an unstoppable force. As I said at the beginning of the video, I've played this game a lot in the last almost 3 years, but every time I get that rocket launcher and destroy the final boss and make it through the final escape sequence, I feel really satisfied. The game remaining so fun during all these modes and levels and repeat playthroughs says a lot. You can play RE4 for hours and hours and never get sick of it. This is a testament to how this is one of the most solidly designed action titles ever produced. Is this the greatest game of all time? Well, I try to think of things I don't like about RE4 and almost nothing comes to mind. This is one of those games that's rich with detail and content. It's a lengthy campaign that knows all the right times to introduce something new to make the experience still feel fresh. It has a meaty post-game, a plethora of modes and unlockables. It's mechanically fine-tuned. It's a leading innovator that's still fun to play to this day. It's a story that will keep you entertained throughout. It's a magnificent game. An absolute era-defining game, lightning in a bottle, this one. It comes together so well that it's hard to imagine how much strife the team went through to reach this point. For me, it's pretty much flawless as far as gameplay is concerned. But all that's basically been said in the video. What does all this mean? Well, despite the fact that I don't tend to bring RE4 up much when it comes to discussing my favorite games, I now have this video to be a testament to how much I enjoy this game, how much I have enjoyed playing this game before and will continue to do so in the future. It's pretty much everything I look for in a game. So again, is it the greatest game of all time? To endure this long and be so iconic, I'd say the case can certainly be made. I think it's entirely fair that this game is included in those discussions. Now, Resident Evil 4 didn't just fundamentally change the third-person shooter genre with its controls, it of course changed the RE series, as the classic formula from 1996 to 2002 was basically abandoned after this game was released. I don't want to dive too deep into that today because, truth be told, I've never actually played Resident Evil 5 and I've never got very far into Resident Evil 6. It was only the survival horror games that I played. Well, I don't know if RE4 and Remake 3 count as those, but you know what I mean. I think it's fair for longtime fans of the series to have felt like RE4 was the origin point of the series losing its identity in the 7th generation of consoles, as it pretty much was. But I also wouldn't say it's fair to hold that against RE4 because this game was giving the franchise some much needed new content compared to something like Zero, which tried that via gimmicks that only hurt the experience. RE4 was needed and got the reception it deserved. How RE5 and 6 handled this new format is a discussion for a different day, especially since I haven't played them. Now to close out, you might be wondering if I'm excited for the upcoming remake of Resident Evil 4 for PlayStation 5. I mean, if I think the original is this close to perfect, am I upset we're getting a remake? Well, I already did a video on that, but to recap, I am not. I realize that no game really needs to justify its own existence to me in a philosophical manner. Publishers fund and release games with the intent to make money on them. That's what every game shares in common. So as a result, my attitude is that I just want to play what's good. I want to play the games that are really fun and show off the talent and passion of the development team. RE4's remake only looks better after the extended gameplay reveal. It looks like RE4's setting and plot and action spectacle combined with RE2 makes tone, characterization, and horror with Last of Us looking combat and user interface. It's like all my Christmases came true at once. The original RE4 is one of the most widely available games of all time, unlike the original RE2 and 3, so it will always exist. I am more than down to see a serious interpretation of RE4's story with the action movie spectacle and one-liners we all know and love. I think it's going to be great. It's the game I'm most hyped for in 2023, and that's saying a lot because a ton of great-looking games are coming out next year, and I can't wait to cover it as soon as it does. On the note of next year, RE4 is my final video for 2022. This year has been quite the journey in terms of content. All things I'm going to detail in my update video for my Patreon audience, but in broad strokes, I'm very proud of what was accomplished on the show this year with the weekly videos, and to all the people who watch my videos, I thank you for that, like I say at the end of every video to the people who watched long enough to hear me say it. Next year is an admittedly nerve-wracking thing for me to think about because it's a lot of unfamiliar territory in terms of topics, but I'm going to go into it with a good attitude and hope that's enough. And I hope everyone looks forward to it as well. And in the meantime, I'll say what I always do. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.